It's T-Frank, and today on the BWI Daily Edition, we're getting to some big news from Penn State football this week. We're also going to take a look ahead at Maryland and something that I know a lot of people have been asking about. We are going to talk wrestling. And the guy to do all of those things, plus even I'm going to sprinkle in a little recruiting, like a little bit of flavor on top, with Greg Pickel. That's coming up today on the BWI Daily Edition. Welcome to the BWI Daily Edition. I'm your host, Thomas Frank Carr. That is the aforementioned Greg Pickel. Greg, how you doing today? It's been a while since we've had you on the show.
I know, T-Frank. It's good to be back on with you as we hit the early part of November. It's hard to believe that it was not long ago, or at least it doesn't feel that long ago, that we were sitting here in, I don't know, July or August talking about the season ahead. And now we are just about to the finish line. So the season has certainly flown by, but I think Penn State fans are cautiously optimistic that a 10-win season is on the horizon. I think the odds makers certainly agree with that.
Yeah, we'll get into the next leg of that, talking about Maryland today. We got a bunch of other things coming up, but the biggest news coming out of yesterday's James Franklin press conference was the fact that Landon Tengwall, left guard for the Nittany Lions, is officially done for the season. What are your thoughts on that situation?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, T-Frank, I think we all knew something was up when he warmed up briefly at Michigan and then kind of disappeared for the portion of warm-ups where if you're at Beaver Stadium early enough, you would, see the kind of starting lineup, so to speak, go through drills right before the end of warm-ups. And he was nowhere to be found. And then when he came back out, he was on the sideline still in his pads, T-Frank, but all of his teammates were going over to congratulate him. And you're not congratulate him, rather, but console him and kind of just give him a pat on the back and tell him everything was going to be okay. So afterwards, James Franklin commenting that he was hurt, but no other details, of course. And then we've seen him in nothing but sweatsuits and his Letterman jacket for the last couple of weeks now. So not terribly surprising news, I don't think, just based on how we've seen things over the last few weeks, but certainly a situation Penn State didn't want to find itself in. And I think if you're looking for a silver lining, and they're hard to find when anytime a player gets hurt, and of course we hope the best for him on the recovery path, T-Frank, but I think the silver lining here is find me another year in the James Franklin era where you could lose a starting starting left guard, rather, and still feel okay about where things are. There's not too many, if any, examples from the past of this being the case. So I think if you're a Penn State fan, you should feel good at least about the fact that the depth along the offensive line, while still not where everyone probably wants it to be, has certainly improved compared to years past.
And it came at a time, I think, in the schedule specifically, excuse me, where playing Indiana that does not have a pass rush and playing Maryland that has not exhibited a strong pass rush so far this season, it does kind of land at the right time, especially considering Olufashanu also got injured recently. What are your thoughts just generally then on the offensive line and how they've been able to weather this storm? And, I know a big talking point this week has been Phil Trautwein. What are your thoughts on that whole conversation?
Again, I think he's probably taken more flack than any Penn State assistant coach in a few years. I mean, this has brought in a number of highly regarded recruits, but it maybe didn't take the step forward that everybody wanted it to. I opened the show by mentioning what we were talking about in July and August. The offensive line was yet again one of those topics. Yep. And so we're talking about it, though, in November, I think, in a different light than we would have in years past. And you're right. The opponent's a part of this. I mean, again, Penn State is facing a pretty favorable portion of its schedule to have this happen. Obviously, I don't know if things would have we know how things went without Tengwall at Michigan. And, if that game was played again today with the current offensive line, however it shakes out on Saturday, I don't know if the results would be much better. But, ultimately you can only do what you can with who you have and who you face. And Penn State passed the first challenge against Indiana. Now we'll see what they do against Maryland. But yeah, I think Trautwein's done a nice job. James Franklin has endlessly mentioned Frank Leonard, who the GA they brought in this offseason, is somebody that's been a sounding board in that offensive line room. We don't know his impact specifically, but I don't think you can deny that he's made one. So I think he's deserved the shout out as well. He's a guy that seems to work well with Trautwein and vice versa. So they've taken a strong step forward, but it's always in college football, T-Frank, what have you done for me lately game. So if Penn State's offensive line, regardless of if Olufashanu's back and regardless of if Caden Wallace is back, if they don't weather the storm well, and there could be a storm, of course, on Saturday with that tropical storm coming this way, hopefully not. But, if they don't weather the storm, if Maryland can devise some things that trips them up with stunts and overload blitzes and things like that, then we're going to be having a much different conversation this time next week. But so far, so good.
Yeah, and that's the thing with film. So 1 week you debut something new, and then the next week teams have picked it apart and found maybe some of the weaknesses in what you've done. So this is going to be an interesting continual process. I mentioned Maryland doesn't have a great pass rush. That doesn't mean they don't have guys that can't win if they're given the opportunity.
Right.
But part of this conversation about the offensive line deals with depth, and as we talked kind of on the outskirts about that part. Penn State's able to put in true freshman Drew Shelton into that left tackle position and get through a game and play well against Indiana. JB Nelson, a part of that conversation. And then, of course, Hunter Nourzad making an announcement this week. For people who didn't see it, fill them in on what he had to say and what you think the impact of that decision is.
Yeah, so he's coming back in 2023 as an extra year to use, obviously. And our Nate Bauer, if you're a subscriber at Blue White Illustrated, I'll let you give the plug here in a second, T-Frank. But he had hinted at this a little while ago that this was a possibility just based on the number situation and, of course, his goals and aspirations and the fact that he had a year left, that it was not out of the question that he would come back for another season. And from the sounds of it, he had conversations with his family, with James Franklin. And unlike some guys, he just didn't want to go to a press conference or didn't want to have to talk with people outside of the walls of the Lash building and I don't want to say lie to him, but mislead him because they didn't want to make the announcement until after the season. He just wanted to get it off his plate. James Franklin thought that was the right idea too. And so that's what led to a 6:25 a.m. announcement on Tuesday on November 8th that he was coming back for another season at Penn State. So it's a big deal. Again, I mean, you can never, as we're seeing right now, you can never have enough quality offensive line depth. And we don't know what's going to happen with some of these guys on the line. As everyone knows, it's not out of the question. Every starter could be back next year, but that's far from a guarantee. And so the more depth you can build, the better. He can play guard. He can play center. He's never going to be able to slide out the tackle at this level, but he has multi-position flexibility. And as we've seen with Bryce Hefner this year, you never know when that's going to come into play.
Yeah, and you start at this point kind of building for the future. If you have Fashanu back, great. If not, you still have some quality players at that left tackle position with Drew Shelton. I mean, you could potentially have a healthy Landon Tengwall, who James Franklin mentioned had surgery. I think that's the right decision, and we'll kind of recap some of this later. But then Hunter Nourzad at center, Vega Ioane, maybe Salim Wormley at right guard, and then, the options at right tackle sound positive, and you can even have a freshman competing there with some of the players that Penn State has in the class of 2023. So lots of bright stuff in the future for Penn State football. Do you think that given all of that, they're still in the position where they're headed in the right trajectory, that they can sustain this depth, going forward, considering Fashanu feels like a guy that is pretty certain, or it feels like there's a strong chance he's going to the NFL after this college football season?
Yeah, so obviously if that happens, which we'll have to wait and see, but losing him would be a blow without question. But, ask me once the transfer portal activity starts, and I hate to make that a cop-out answer, but, again, it's no different than any other position. You can go from having good numbers there to all of a sudden some guys that are further down the depth chart feel like they can play somewhere else, be it a lower level or otherwise, or maybe they just don't want to keep going with the grind of football. And I'm not saying any of those guys in that Penn State offensive line room are thinking that way right now, but just look at how long some of them have been here without making an impact, and no one's going to be shocked if there's some movement in that room. So you could go from a situation where you feel really good about your numbers to one where you're back into an iffy proposition again. And if you don't hit the portal and get some guys, that could remain into spring practice and then summer camp. So, it's hard. It's really challenging. I don't envy the coaches and the people that manage the rosters because you just don't know. I mean, you can get a good feel for your room and you can have an idea of what guys are thinking and all that kind of stuff, but you just don't know until they make that decision. And some of them will make it early. Some of them may have already made it. Now we've seen across the country where, Jack Tuttle, great example. He's already in the plans to leave, but he stayed to play. And it's a good thing he did because Indiana needs him right now. But, there could be guys in this Penn State program. In fact, the law of averages says that there are that have their mind made up. They're going to stick it out and help this team this season, but then they're leaving. So, it's hard to, I think, more than ever, assess the future health of a roster because you just don't know what's going to happen when those portal windows open up. But I would say at this second in time, they're on the right trajectory, but it can change in a hurry.
Yeah, back to Tengwall. I think that's going to be like getting an additional starter back next season
Mhm.
or getting an additional recruit because what I saw from him this year was not the same football player. So whatever was going on, hopefully he gets it corrected. Gets it corrected now so that he can go through an offseason of rebuilding his strength and rebuilding whatever it is that was
Right.
wrong. That is a huge thing because part of the conversation about this offensive line this year was talking about possibly some higher highs with that left side of the offensive line having so much talent. And unfortunately, kind of feels like that's going to get split up before we could ever see it. But it doesn't mean that there isn't really good potential coming back next year, especially when you got some of those young guys that seem like they're very, very talented entering into the starting lineup. But Greg, you made a good point earlier. We need to mention this. Subscribe to Blue White Illustrated right now. BlueWhiteIllustrated.com is $10 until next season. So you get insider access through the end of the season, recruiting, National Signing Day, transfer portal, everything that we hear with all of the ears that we have to the ground. You get that information in the Lions Den message form and, of course, in premium articles. $10 for the next however many months that is. I'm not doing the math right now because I need to tell you about another thing, which is please like the video. Make sure you share this with your friends. The BWI Daily Edition is one of the best Penn State football podcasts and YouTube shows out there. It is the most active. Nobody else is coming to you 5 days a week with conversation, insight, and talk about Penn State football and sports. So make sure you like the video and subscribe. We are agonizingly close to 9,000 followers on the channel. By the time you see this video, I'm hoping we're there because, of course, we got practice coming up tonight, and we got more information from James Franklin on the way. You don't want to miss any of that. So subscribe to the channel. What are the other things that stood out from yesterday's press conference that, are on your mind today and throughout the week that we've seen so far?
Yeah, T-Frank, obviously it's hard to get past the offensive line stuff. That was really the big key takeaway, even though we only learned specifics about one issue. They're hopeful to have Caden Wallace back. What does that mean? Excuse me. We'll see. They've talked about guys hopefully coming back before, and then it hasn't worked out. So, I would put him, this is my words, not anybody else's, but he seems like he's in the game time decision category. Olufashanu was categorized as more of a week-to-week situation. So I don't know what that means, but it certainly is a different word than hopeful that he'll be back this week, or a phrase rather. So right. Time's going to tell there. We'll see. But those things stood out, but ultimately, I look back at yesterday's news conference, and James Franklin was asked some questions about signature wins and what they mean and the value of them. And, again, you want to be able to do both is what he got into, which was you want the signature wins, the wins over Ohio State and Michigan in Penn State's case, but you need to do it consistently too. If you just get one, it's not that big of a deal. I look at what Mike Loxley said yesterday when he spoke to reporters on Tuesday during his news conference. And I don't know if he was asked if this was a rivalry game or if he just brought it up himself. I haven't seen the video, but he said, no, it's not a rivalry game. We got to win more if we want it to be that. And obviously Maryland is 41-3-1, I believe it is, against Penn State all time. So two of those wins coming in the last 9 years, of course. But yeah, ultimately that was kind of the takeaway for me. I think Penn State feels good about where it's at right now overall. But, again, there are key questions and injury conversations that are being had on both sides of the ball. And, until you get to game day this time of year, you might not know all the situations you need to solve. You might have an idea, but, if a guy's close and needs to go through warmups or what have you to see if he's ready to play, then you're not going to have those answers until a little before kickoff. So, that's where things are at this point. I think Penn State feels confident going into this week. Believe it was the first press conference, T-Frank, in a month, maybe more, without a Drew Aller, Sean Clifford question. So there was that. That's notable, which I thought was interesting. But yeah, all told, pretty cut and dry news conference yesterday. The injury stuff is the biggest highlight, and ultimately Penn State just got to keep preparing whoever it has available to be ready to be available to play on Saturday.
Is that well dry? Is that why? Because I know that the desire for that conversation and content has not gone away based on my interactions with the internet and with fans. So is it just like people are tired of asking and getting the same question from James Franklin? Because I know
I think we might be at that point. I mean, check out the YouTube page here tonight for James Franklin's Wednesday news conference, and maybe you'll get your wish and we'll get a Drew Aller, Sean Clifford question. But I just don't know. I don't think there's nothing more to ask on that topic at this point. James Franklin for 9 years now has been perfectly blunt in that he is going to give away as few details as humanly possible about his game plan and his personnel usage on Tuesday or Wednesday before a Saturday game, with an obvious reason for that, to not give the other team an advantage when they're trying to set their game plan. So if you think he's going to stand there and say, yep, We're going to play Drew Aller the second series of the second quarter and the first three of the first half, the second half or whatever. If you think you're going to get some specific information, or if you think he's going to review a quarterback change before the game, neither of those things are going to happen.
Yeah. Well, so like I said, we haven't had you on in a while. What's your thought about this season so far? What is kind of your high level takeaway from these first 10 games or so?
Yeah, I mean, I think the challenging thing is when you say 10 games or 9 games, I guess it's been going into number 10, but, a 10-win season is on the line, and it feels like there is very little buzz about that fact. And, I'm sure that you and Nate discussed it on the show here, but, the 4-team college football playoff is a huge part of that. And once you're out of that race, the air goes out of the balloon to a large extent. But this is a developing football team. It's interesting to me that so many people thought this was going to be a gap year and that this was the year to get ready for 2023. And if you watch week in and week out, you see a lot of evidence that this is a team getting ready for 2023 with a lot of young players contributing in significant ways. Are they always doing everything right? No. And do they make mistakes? You bet. But are they developing from week one to now? I don't think there's any question. And still, with all that being said, this is a team that can win 10 games and go to a New Year's Six Bowl for the first time since 2019. So I'm a little surprised the excitement level around this team seems to be as low as it is. Maybe that's just my perception, and I'm sure I'll be told in the comments whether I'm right or wrong. But that's my biggest thought right now is that if you went into this season thinking that it was a building year, then I think you should be pretty excited about what's building and also paying close attention to how it's getting done because there's a lot of it going on right now.
Yeah, I don't think some people, I don't think they've adjusted their expectations from that building year and wanting to throw out the season to sacrifice for next year when Penn State's getting the best of both worlds. Like, you got to see Drew Aller for 20 plus minutes against Indiana. He's gotten to play significant playing time. And I know that Nate was talking about this earlier. He's played more than most of the redshirt freshmen have gone on to win the Heisman Trophy and been, serious contenders in the college football playoff and all of those benchmarks that Penn State fans are expecting out of Aller and Penn State in the future. He's already got more experience than all of them anyway. So it's a very fascinating season where everyone tossed it out, or I shouldn't say everyone. A percentage of fans tossed it out because they didn't care because Sean Clifford was the quarterback, and it feels like the expectations haven't been adjusted from there. And then, of course, when you lose to Ohio State and Maryland, there is that feeling.
Well, they didn't lose to Maryland yet. Michigan.
I'm Michigan. Thank you. I was watching Michigan Maryland earlier today, and apparently, if it starts with an M, it's the same thing in my head. So speaking of Maryland, let's get to that. What are your thoughts if you've seen anything of them so far?
So I posted a matchup story over at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com on Wednesday morning. I mean, I don't know what you saw on the film T-Frank. I only watched a little bit, certainly not as much as you, but going through the box scores and reading a whole bunch today. I mean, this game I can see. So going into this week, I heard a lot of people saying, or even this month, that Maryland was going to be the toughest opponent Penn State faced. And I kind of scoffed at it. I was like, nah, I don't think that's the case. But, there are reasons that I see that this game could be competitive, but I got two big problems. I don't know what the health is of Talia Tagovailoa. Is he 80%, 90%, 100%? He certainly did not look at Wisconsin last week, anywhere close to it for that matter. And I think most people were making that prediction under the assumption that Maryland would be able to score enough points to win this game. And with Raheem Jarrett being a game time decision, I think they have some other bumps and bruises, as everyone does on offense at this time of the year. And you combine that with what you said earlier in the show about, they're an okay pass rush and they have some decent defenders, but they're not going to blow you off the ball, I don't think, or blow you away. Maybe with a makeshift offensive line they will. We'll see. But I still feel pretty good about my hunch, but I can see why people felt that way. And, obviously after 4 quarters on Saturday, I'll either be right or wrong. But, there are some pieces there that Mike Locksley has brought in that I think could challenge Penn State. I just don't think they have enough to do it for 4 quarters, and especially is the case if Tagovailoa is not 100%.
Yeah, so the magic of Talia is that he can extend plays, and he is a very dangerous quarterback when he throws on the run. But it's interesting. He's gone from a very aggressive quarterback throwing the ball and pushing it down into windows downfield. This season, the offense has a very different feel about it. They're running the football more. They have more talented running backs, so they're emphasizing that a little bit more, taking some of the stuff off his plate, but they're still running a lot of screens. So where they took all I feel like where the running game took some of the play percentages was those intermediate and deep passes, and he's passing up some of those decisions and some of those opportunities. I find that to be curious and interesting. And then specifically last week, they had a serious problem at center. Number 51 could not snap the football. He couldn't snap the football, and then he couldn't block.
Right.
And that's
it's kind of a bad thing for a center, T-Frank.
Yeah, that's 90% of his job, and then he's not doing any of those things after the snap. So I got the sense that Tagovailoa was kind of pressing, and then the decision making of what to do, and that innate instinct he had, I feel like it got a little frazzled because of the injury and because he was under constant pressure. The running backs do not block well in pass protection, so that's another part of that. But that's if that team comes into Happy Valley, I don't think that they can put up points. But I don't know that it's necessarily injury, because he was still making people miss, and he was still running, he was still mobile. But to me, it was more a mental thing with him. And that's what I saw. But like you mentioned with Mike Locksley and talking about this series, this feels like a signature win opportunity for the Terrapins.
No doubt.
And it feels like one of those moments where they're going to throw the kitchen sink at this game plan. So there's going to be stuff on film we haven't seen. And that's what I'm interested in. That and how they use their screen game, because they throw more screens than anybody else in the Big Ten. And how that goes up against Penn State and Manny Diaz's very aggressive defense. That's going to be a big part of the story on Saturday to me. The defense and, what you've seen of them and Penn State's offense and their banged up offensive line, I think you gave away what you're kind of thinking for the overall game, but is there a matchup you've seen from the stats or something you've seen that concerns you when you're looking at this game plan?
No, I wouldn't say there's something I said. You actually just hit the nail right on the head. It's not something I see that would concern me. It's something that we haven't seen that they're going to throw at Penn State in this game that is going to be potentially problematic. I think that, and look, that happens every week in college football. But to your point, Penn State in this November stretch where they're going to be favored, presumably in every single game and possibly by double digits in all of them, they're going to get everyone's best shot. And especially if they continue to win, now, okay, you can beat a top 15 Penn State team. Okay, you can knock off a top 12 Penn State team. Okay, you can maybe knock off a top 10 Penn State team, depending on what happens around college football and Penn State continuing to win. But no, that would be the biggest concern to me is when you're trying to prepare Drew Shelton or Vega Ione or JB Nelson or someone to take more snaps at right tackle than they have previously, or left tackle, or whatever it may be. What is Maryland going to be able to throw at Penn State, whether it's Jayshon Barham blitzing from different places, whether it's something stunt-wise or misdirection-wise with their defensive linemen? I mean, what are they going to throw at Penn State that these guys just have never seen before, either because they're young or because they are taking on a team that has nothing to lose at this point? I mean, Maryland's 6-3. They've qualified for a bowl game. So, I mean, it's not like they have to, but they're going into hostile territory and they want to upset Penn State. They want to leave with a signature win. And so that would be the concern that I see. Not that anything on tape necessarily blows me away in terms of Penn State not being able to handle it, just the idea that, what are they going to throw at you on either side of the ball, whether it's, so you're talking about the screens and maybe some different ways of doing that to confuse the defense, or is it going to be something on offense that Maryland does defensively? But I think you're going to see some things that Penn State's going to have to adjust to on the fly with some young players on the field.
So I wanted to put this up here because you make a good point. And part of this conversation about the final month of the season to me comes down to trust, the certain trust factor. And this is something that I've been wrestling with for a good part of the season is, we came in saying Penn State needed to score points this year. And if you look at the season, I wanted to bring this up specifically so we could see the point totals: 35, 46, 41, 33, 17, 17, 45, 31, 45. So Penn State, more games than not, has put up 30-plus points in a game. But there's a couple games this year that make you feel a little uneasy in that, that lost to Ohio State. There's a garbage time touchdown in there. So I've had to come to grips with, kind of after the Minnesota game, that I can trust this offense to put up at least 30 points. Where are you when it comes to Penn State's offense and kind of the floor of, I know going into a game that they're possible of scoring X number of points per time they step on the football field?
So I guess I have two answers to that. One would be that this Penn State offense with Mike Yurcich as constructed with either Sean Clifford or Drew Aller at helm, regardless of the offensive line situation against Maryland, should be able to score 30 points at least. I just don't see any reason for that. If you just went to Indiana, which I know is worse than Maryland, but you just went to Indiana and put up 45 on the road with your backup quarterback playing a lot of snaps, you should have no issue doing that at home against a Maryland team. But you've had a lot of success against home and away over the years. But, again, I go back to the first quarter of the Indiana game, T-Frank, and the concerns that we saw on offense there are why people have trust factors with that being the case. I mean, it just is the fact of the matter. And if you extrapolate, that's something that
they at least scored a touchdown. They at least scored one touchdown in the first quarter last week.
It was still ugly. And so, I think that the issue that people have is, okay, so sometimes they break that mold, for lack of a better word that I can think of at the moment, in the first quarter. Sometimes it takes until the second half. Sometimes it's midway through the second quarter. And so do I trust it to score 30 points? I think so. Can it score 30 points? Absolutely. But where do those two meet in the middle? And I think we're going to find out more about this Penn State team, even though we're already 9 games into the season. We're going to find out more about whether or not this Penn State team can continue doing it on Saturday. I picked them. We'll have the picks out at bluewhiteillustrated.com today. The score 35. So I clearly think it's something that's going to happen. But, again, if they would win like the Northwestern game, 21-10 or 17-7 or 24-17 or something like that. Like, I don't think anybody would be shocked or surprised or just, in utter disbelief that happened. So, I can kind of see it both ways, but I do think it'll happen. I absolutely think they have the ability to do it.
Yeah, it's just that's kind of the conversation I've been having in my head with myself of like each week you can see, okay, well, what if the offense struggles to run the football against a Maryland defense that got some big bodies in the middle that do certain things that can challenge you with a young offensive line. And that happened last week, and they still scored 45 points. The evidence stacks up that they can score points. So I'm kind of trying to convince myself each week that the baseline is like what I said earlier, 30. But I understand because going all the way back to the first game of the season when James Franklin said, I think it was either halftime or post game on television, he said, inconsistent on offense. Well, that describes one player in particular at the quarterback position. And if that position's inconsistent, that's what you're going to get. Right. This is the part that I want to get into recruiting with. Regional game, Maryland, huge recruiting bed for Penn State, a massively important area. What do you expect on that end this week in terms of interest in this game? And, kind of the regionality, maybe bringing in some higher profile guys. Do you think either of those are likely?
I think it's possible. Look, anytime you have a 3:30 game, it helps. There's no doubt about it. And you also keep in mind, now look, it's Wednesday and we're going to get into wrestling here. And a lot of my attention has been there and not on recruiting this week. So I don't want to get too far astray here. And then you all read something on bluewhiteillustrated.com or you hear from Ryan or Sean later in the week and I'm totally off base. But I think two things that jump out to me is one, it's a 3:30 game. So it's easier for guys to get there if they want to come. And two, there are so many guys in this region with connections to both Penn State and Maryland. So that could help Penn State's chances as well. But I mean, again, I don't want to go too far down that road because I just haven't spent enough time on it this week. But what I will say is that there is an official visitor. Cameron Wallace is going to be in town. He put out that news on Tuesday. Ryan Schneider covered it at Blue White Illustrated. Mount Vernon, Georgia, Montgomery County prospect, 6 foot, 180-pound running back. Keep in mind, as I'm sure you've heard here on the Daily or on the recruiting show, Penn State looking for another running back now that London Montgomery is recovering from that ACL injury. So I just want to pull the stats up here to make sure I have this right. So Wallace through 9 games, he's total 1,020 yards on 120 carries and 12 touchdowns. That obviously averages out to about 10 yards a carry, which is pretty good. There's worse. Yeah, you could certainly do worse. We've seen worse here at Penn State, so certainly can do worse. But yeah, he's the big name to know right now. We're going to have a lot more later this week on who will be in town, but I don't think there's any question that the regionality factor and the 3:30 kick time factor helps Penn State get guys to a game like this.
Yeah, so we will have a recruiting update on Friday on the BWI Daily Edition with Ryan Snyder. The Tuesday show was canceled for a couple of reasons, so hopefully that doesn't happen too much in the future. But, I was off yesterday and there were some conflicts, so we will get you that recruiting information later in the week. But you mentioned wrestling, and that's a big thing this week was Cale Sanderson's season opening press conference. So take us through what you heard and saw from him earlier this week. It was on Monday, I
It
believe.
was, yeah. It was Monday at Rec Hall. Of course, Penn State will be inside Rec Hall on Friday night to take on Lock Haven to open the season. Cale Sanderson didn't make a ton of news, which is pretty much his, right up his alley in terms of these news
Were you
conferences.
surprised he was there? Were you surprised
No,
that he was there
I
and
mean,
sitting?
I will say this. I mean, like all of Penn State's coaches, he is very good with the media. He's almost always available. I mean, yeah, I mean, from time to time, he'll have some other responsibilities and he'll put one of his assistant coaches out. But for the most part, yeah, Cale's great with that stuff. And, he did a lot of Zooms last year. This year was in person for the first time. So that was good. But I mean, yeah, I'll just run down the news and notes of the day pretty quickly. Robbie Howard, a 125-pounder who missed last season due to injury. Unfortunately, it's going to miss this season due to injury. So that means redshirt freshman Gary Steen, who was very good in high school, is going to be your starter at 125 pounds. Of course, Penn State returns 4 national champions and 5 All-Americans from last year. So there's not a whole lot of open spots. Bo Bartlett, who many of you remember from last season, drops down from 149 to fill in for Nick Lee at 141. Shane Van Ness, a very talented redshirt freshman, is going to jump into the 149 role. 157, Terrell Barraclaw, who's a familiar face, is going to get first ups there. I know a lot of people thought Levi Haynes might win that job out of the gate. Sounds like Penn State's still working on the best plan for him. A new rule this year, T-Frank, in college wrestling, just similar to college football, is that you can wrestle in 5 matches and still retain a year of eligibility. So for Penn State, it's going to have to decide what it wants to do there. Does it want to try and get him in some matches at the college level, see where he's at? He was, of course, very good competing in open competition during his senior year of high school. Didn't even wrestle as a senior year of high school. In the prep level, wrestled open competition and did very well. So I don't think there's any doubt about his ability, but the phrase Cale Sanderson used was, we're not going to rush anybody out there. So this could be one of those things. I think we're probably going to know more about what the plan is at the mid-semester break than we do right now. And then the other new starter is Alex Facundo, another redshirt freshman who is very talented. So, I mean, we joke about it all the time every time I join you to talk wrestling, but the rich just keep richer. They just reload I'm not going to sit here and run down the accolades of all these new wrestlers because they're all long and storied and a who's who and a what's what. So very good outlook for Penn State, but Cale Sanderson is the master of the obvious in the best way possible. I mean, it's all about scoring points, and the wrestler has to want to score points and want to wrestle the Penn State way. And if he does that, he's going to have success more often than not. But the coaches can only do so much to put the guys in that position, and they have to go out and do it. So we'll see if these new faces do it Friday night and moving forward. But Penn State, again, picked to win the NCAA title. No real surprise there, and have numerous favorites to repeat as NCAA champions as well.
So you mentioned a couple of new starters, some redshirt freshmen. Would you describe this team as young? Because I know you mentioned having so much experience coming back, but it feels like there is a bit of a young and mature part of the roster. Is that a fair way? How would you describe this lineup as it is?
So it's interesting because you have 3 guys who, are in their redshirt freshman season at 125, 149, and 165 who are starters new for the first time in redshirt freshmen. But the rest of these guys have been here for a while. 197-pounder Max Dean was joking that he's 7 years removed now from high school, but still is an undergraduate because of, remember, he was at Cornell, and their academic schedule and athletics obviously were handled differently than than other schools, including Penn State, during the coronavirus pandemic. So he has he's going to graduate, I think he said in December. I hate to misquote him on that, but I believe he said in December. So, but that was funny. But no, they have a very experienced room here. And, again, when you reload, you're always going to have an element of youth. There's no question about that. But they have enough veteran leadership, obviously, led by Roman Bravo Young, Carter Starachi, Aaron Brooks, Max Dean, of course, Greg Kirkfleet, that they have a bunch of guys who have been there, done that before, and will be able to lead those guys every step of the way, whether it's their first Rec Hall match, whether it's their first Bryce Jordan Center match, or, of course, whether it's Big Ten and Nationals, depending on who qualifies there. So, the goal, as it always is 10 All-Americans and 10 national champions. And That's not easy to do. I think there's only been one team ever maybe that had all 10 All-Americans. I could be wrong on that, but I think I'm right. So it's not an easy thing to do, and Penn State's a program that has been very successful and, again, has the talent in the room to do it, but the guys got to want it and go out and do it. So we'll see what they can do. But first match Friday night against Lock Haven. We'll have complete coverage of Blue White Illustrated throughout the night and then over the weekend as well.
So what do you think are the interesting parts of the lineup? Where do you think we're going to see the most either shuffling or competition for spots? What do you think is going to be the really fascinating one to watch throughout the season?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things. So number one, obviously, Penn State wrestling fans know that 125 has been a tough weight for Penn State over the last number of years. It's just one they can't seem to quite figure out in the recruiting process for whatever reason. Guys get here and they're really highly regarded and it just doesn't work out. Injuries pop up, what have you. So fascinating to see if Steen can stop a run of what has been very up and down wrestling at 125 pounds. At 133, Roman Bravo Young, I don't think he's going to wrestle every dual meet this year. I think they're going to give some other guys, Bailey Shunk being one of them, some opportunities to wrestle and get mat time. So be interested to see how many matches he wrestles this year. At 141, Bo Bartlett finally at his natural weight. A breakout season is what many expect for him. Can he do it? We'll see. Obviously, the redshirt freshman talked about earlier, those guys are just chomping at the bit rather, to get out on the mat and get ready for their first rec hall experience and to get their college careers underway. So, I mean, in terms of lineup turnover, I guess 25 is a possibility, though I don't see a whole lot of movement happening there unless it comes from the portal. And then again at 157, can Terrell Bearclaw take a bear claw on that job, for lack of a better poor pun and cliche? But can he do it, or will Levi Haynes move in at some point, or would Joe Lee even possibly? I guess Joe Lee's at 165 now, so that's not going to happen. But would Levi Haynes move in at 157 at some point? That's really about all the question marks this team faces, of course, unless they would go into the transfer portal, which of course they did last year at 125 pounds mid-semester. So that's always a possibility as well.
I appreciate the effort on the pun. So that's all we can ask for is effort at this point.
Well, if there's one person out there that laughed, it's one more than I was counting on. So,
what else? Anything left? Anything left? I didn't ask anything interesting to you that I failed to pick up on.
No, I mean, I think we covered a lot of it here. It's Penn State wrestling. It's one of those things where, again, unlike football, unlike basketball, there's just not a whole lot of question marks, and there's not a whole lot to be worried about or concerned about or controversy. I mean, no one's sitting there saying, gee, I wish Roman Bravo Young didn't come back for a sixth year. I mean, we don't have any of those situations when we're talking about Penn State wrestling. So, no, it's just, again, I think the most fascinating thing about this program is that it just reloads and refires, but there's different storylines that pop up every year, whether it's injuries, whether it's issues in a certain weight class. It's almost never, I shouldn't say it's never, but it's almost never a perfectly smooth ride from November until March, when Cale Sanderson and his team are standing in the middle of the podium at nationals as NCAA champions. Of course, as everyone knows, there have been hiccups in the past and things like that. So there's always something interesting to follow, always something for fans to maybe worry about or discuss and debate. But right now, I think everything is set, and we'll have those conversations as the season gets rolling.
Greg Pickel, Blue White Illustrated, our intrepid reporter. All reporters, I feel like, are intrepid, but he is the most intrepid of the reporters, covering everything: recruiting, basketball, football, hockey. I'm just adding all these things to your list, by the way. So
okay, great. Just pile it on, T-Frank. My plate is ready to be piled on. Yes.
So we'll be back with the BWI Daily Edition. That's coming up tomorrow, our official preview of Maryland. Fitz hopefully is feeling better today or tomorrow, and Nate will be back as well. So we'll have the daily coming up for you tomorrow, getting you prepared for the weekend. And of course, we got best bets coming up on Friday with Ryan, our discussion, my look at the game coming up Friday as well. All that here on the BWI Daily Edition. If you're listening on the podcast version, please download, rate, review, subscribe, all those great things. Apple Podcasts. If you give the review, that helps us out. Even if you just want to put one word in 5 stars, it's super helpful. Lets other people know that the BWI Daily Edition exists. And we get to do this more. Maybe someday, Greg, I'll get a staff.
There you go.
Yeah. Get an editor. So you can dream, you can dream.
But
until
buddy.
Then,
can't reach the stars if you don't shoot for them.
Exactly. Until then, though, we'll keep chugging along, doing everything at the highest possible level that anyone on YouTube does anywhere. BWI Daily Edition returning tomorrow. We'll talk to you then.